The human had always imagined exile would be dull, maybe lonely, perhaps even mildly humiliating, but nothing had prepared them for the sight that greeted them as the transport ship disgorged them onto the nursery world. The air smelled faintly of caramel and ozone, and the ground beneath their boots was soft, almost bouncy, like walking on a giant marshmallow. The nursery itself looked like a child's dreamscape had been thrown into a zero-gravity simulator. Cribs floated in midair, tethered by glowing filaments. Oversized mobiles of geometric shapes and iridescent lights rotated lazily above. Tiny creatures zipped around, giggling, or squealing, in high-pitched, musical tones that made the human's ears ring. They froze, blinking, trying to make sense of what was clearly meant to be punishment. At first glance, the nursery appeared harmless, maybe even charming. Tiny plushy aliens with round bodies, 6 stubby limbs, and impossibly large eyes stared at them, bouncing with curiosity. Some had fuzzy antennae that wiggled in patterns too precise to be random. Others had translucent wings that shimmered like soap bubbles, leaving trails of sparkles in the air. The human's instinct was to step carefully, to apologize for invading their space, as if walking too loudly might offend these alien infants. That instinct evaporated entirely within seconds when a small one, about the size of a basketball but with far too many eyes, launched itself toward the human, squealing in delight, then wrapped every limb it had around the human arm, hugging as if life depended on it. The human yelped and staggered, nearly tipping over, arms flailing as the creature's surprisingly strong grip held firm. Their punishment had already begun, though it didn't yet feel like punishment, more like being trapped inside a nightmare crafted by a sugar-happy god. A small, hovering tablet appeared in front of them, projecting an interface that hummed with neon light. Instructions scrolled across it in a language the human could barely parse, but certain words leapt out. Play, nap, lesson, obedience. And most curiously, pheromones. The human frowned, trying to ignore the faint tingling sensation crawling across their skin as they watched one of the infants waddle toward a glowing orb and push it with a stubby appendage, sending it spiraling into a patch of soft, bouncy moss. The orb emitted a strange vibration and a faint scent, and immediately, several other infants converged on it, wriggling and squealing in coordinated chaos. The human tried to intervene, reasoning like a diplomat. Oh, that's not, perhaps I should. But before they could finish, they had been grabbed by 2 more infants, dragged into a tumbling pile of giggles, fluff, and pheromone clouds that smelled faintly of almonds and something metallic. Their clothes were already sticky, their hair coated in glittering slime, and they realized quickly that this was no ordinary childcare setting. Somehow, even the tiniest movement carried a subtle, magnetic suggestion to the creatures around them, a pull the human could neither explain nor resist. They staggered to their feet, wiping goo off their uniform, and noticed a small, plushy adult hovering nearby. It looked almost identical to the infants except for its slightly more refined wings and an air of smug amusement. Its antennae waved lazily as it observed, and a soft, melodic trill echoed in its voice. The human attempted speech, uncertain whether words or gestures would be understood. Hello? I think I'm... The alien cut them off with a flick of one of its stubby limbs, producing a shimmering, translucent screen in midair. Instructions flashed. Lesson 1. Understanding Attraction Through Play. Beneath the title were diagrams that made no immediate sense, swirling colors, geometric limb patterns, and an illustration of a human figure tangled with several infants in positions that made the human blink and glance away in horror. They swallowed hard. That did not look innocent. A low, musical chime signaled the start of the lesson. The infants immediately began moving toward the human, each performing gestures that, somehow, felt absurdly familiar and yet entirely alien. They spun in tiny circles, lifted limbs in synchronized patterns, and emitted soft coos that made the air thrum with a subtle vibration. The human felt themselves blush despite themselves, trying to reason. This is just a game, it's just play? But their limbs were already being drawn into awkward mimicry. As they clumsily twirled and flailed, they discovered that the infants responded differently to each motion, sometimes squealing with delight, sometimes recoiling in mock offense. The patterns were clearly deliberate, a curriculum disguised as chaos, and the human realized with a sinking feeling that they were learning far more than playtime. The first attempt ended in disaster. The human misjudged a step, landing on a soft mound of moss that expelled a puff of pheromonal dust into the air. Immediately, a dozen infants swarmed, wrapping them in a wriggling, giggling mass. Each movement they made prompted squeals, coos, and gentle tugging that left them disoriented and sticky. Trying to extricate themselves only made things worse. Their uniform was drenched in glittering slime, their hair coated in luminous powder, and a faint warmth spread across their chests that had nothing to do with exertion. The plushy adult hovered nearby, watching with mild amusement, occasionally flicking a limb to adjust the flow of infants like a conductor guiding a symphony of chaos. As the human lay sprawled on the floor, catching their breath, they noticed a small note floating down from the tablet. The words were simple, almost childlike. Lesson 1 complete. Next, cooperation and attraction. They groaned. Cooperation? Attraction? Attraction to whom, or what? The infants' innocent smiles were deeply, unsettlingly knowing. Somehow, the lessons were teaching them not just how to play, not just how to survive in this bizarre nursery, but how to respond, adapt, and eventually participate in the strange, absurd, and undeniably erotic dance that these creatures had been orchestrating from the moment they arrived. The human blinked, realizing that exile had not been punishment at all, it had been preparation, and they were the unwitting student of a curriculum far more dangerous, and far more ridiculous, than anything they had imagined. They took a deep breath, braced themselves, and shuffled toward the first tiny creature that seemed to be gesturing for a new game. If survival meant dancing along, then they would dance. If the lesson required humiliation, they would endure it. And if it required understanding alien attraction in ways that no human could ever hope to predict, well, then they would do that too. The nursery had claimed its new pupil, and there was no turning back. The first lesson had barely ended when the human was swept into the next exercise, a floating arena that looked suspiciously like a playground designed by someone with a love for chaos and mild danger. The air shimmered with tiny motes of light that carried scents both sweet and pungent, and the ground, if it could be called that, undulated like liquid silk. The infants flitted through it with the grace of drunken ballerinas, laughing and squealing as they zipped past, and the human quickly realized that their survival and dignity depended entirely on their ability to move in sync with this maddening rhythm. The plushy adult hovered nearby, arms crossed, or the alien equivalent thereof, watching with a lazy grin that suggested amusement at every misstep. A faint trill of music emanated from the walls, punctuated by low hums from the hovering toys, and the human realized, with a mix of horror and fascination, that this was no ordinary lesson. Every movement, every twitch of a limb, was a calculated experiment in teaching them how to respond to alien attraction. The first exercise, called Catch the Pheromone Bubble, began innocuously enough. A dozen small, glowing spheres floated around the arena, releasing faint, sweet scents that made the air thicken with something almost intoxicating. The instruction was simple in theory: touch the bubbles, avoid colliding with the infants, and maintain balance. In practice, it was a nightmare. Every time the human reached for a bubble, a squealing infant would zip past, knocking them off balance. Attempting to dodge one bubble led to another bumping into their chest, and before long, they were spinning in a dizzying circle, arms flailing, hair plastered with glittery slime, and a sense of helplessness creeping in. And yet, every stumble produced a reaction from the infants, sometimes delighted squeals, sometimes mock reproach. The human realized with dawning horror that they were being trained, not in play, but in a kind of bodily negotiation, the precise angles, gestures, and even breathing patterns that drew positive attention from these tiny creatures. It was ridiculous, humiliating, and strangely instructive. Next came the mirror dance, which involved a series of floating platforms, each reflecting the human's image in a funhouse distortion. The infants lined the platform's edges, their large eyes glittering with mischievous anticipation. The human was instructed to mimic the infant's movements, twist a limb here, tilt a head there, but the catch was that every error sent a ripple of pheromones through the air, causing the other infants to react with exaggerated enthusiasm. One misstep, and the human found themselves being spun around, arms caught by sticky tendrils that shot out from the walls, the infants squealing in delight as if the mistake were part of the lesson. The human stumbled, their movements awkward, but gradually began to notice patterns, the timing of gestures, the subtle shifts in scent, even the way the infants' eyes followed them. It was absurd, almost pornographic in implication, but undeniably effective. They were learning, whether they wanted to or not, how to read signals, respond to attention, and move in a way that elicited desire. By the time they reached the sharing the cuddle pod exercise, the human's mind was a jumble of panic, fascination, and sticky slime. The pod itself was a large, translucent sphere that floated midair, gently rotating. The instructions were to enter, interact with the infants, and maintain contact in a cooperative manner. Sounds simple. It was not. The infants piled in from all sides, limbs entwining, wings brushing, and the human found themselves pressed into a tangle of bodies, desperately trying to keep from falling over or suffocating in the sticky, pheromone-laden chaos. Every attempt at control failed spectacularly, sending them flailing into the pod's soft walls, only to be greeted with squeals of delight. It was humiliating, physically exhausting, and yet mesmerizing. The human's arms, legs, and body were being guided through movements that, in a human context, would be flirtatious, seductive, and entirely adult in nature. But here, framed as play, it was both absurd and painfully instructive. Amid the chaos, the older alien assistant watched with a mix of amusement and pride. Occasionally it floated over to give the human a subtle hint, a tilt of the head, a flick of an antenna, a soft trill, and the human found themselves following the cue, surprised at how effective it was. The assistant's guidance was playful, teasing, and utterly bewildering. It bordered on flirtation, and the human felt a flush rise to their cheeks despite themselves. Between the sticky tangles, the pheromone overloads, and the relentless chaos, a bizarre bond began to form. The human started anticipating cues, matching gestures, and even finding a strange rhythm in the madness. The lesson was absurdly erotic, undeniably humiliating, and hilariously over the top, but it was also revealing. They were learning not just to survive, but to adapt, charm, and participate in alien attraction, even if the whole process felt like being a puppet in a sexualized puppet show. By the end of the session, the human lay sprawled on the soft, bouncing floor, limbs tangled with 3 particularly aggressive infants, glitter and slime coating their uniform, hair, and every inch of skin. Their chest heaved, a mixture of exhaustion, adrenaline, and a faint, disorienting warmth they did not entirely understand. The plushy adult floated over, clapping, or the alien equivalent, and emitted a trill that meant approval. The human groaned, realizing that this was only the beginning. Each lesson, each ridiculous game, was designed to strip away their human embarrassment, teach them alien courtship techniques, and push them into absurdly erotic situations, all while maintaining the facade of play. They were learning more than they ever intended: balance, timing, scent coordination, limb synchronization, and a humiliating, strangely intoxicating understanding of attention and attraction. Exile had become an absurd, adult-tinged education, and the human had no choice but to continue dancing through it, limbs flailing, heart racing, and mind reeling. The lessons intensified the following day, or perhaps it was the same day stretched into eternity. Time in the nursery had a way of folding in on itself, like a soft, malleable pastry that refused to hold its shape. The human had barely recovered from the sticky chaos of the previous exercises when they were summoned to the central arena, a vast floating platform surrounded by transparent walls that shimmered with faint, pulsating colors. The infants waited, some bouncing in anticipation, others flitting lazily with their wings spread wide, as if the entire room were one enormous, absurdly seductive playground. The plushy adult hovered nearby, its antennae twitching, eyes glinting with mischief, and the human realized with a sinking sense of inevitability that they were about to be tested in ways far more intense and humiliating than before. The first exercise of the day was called Dance of Multi-Species Appeal. A low, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor and into the human's bones, and the floating spheres began to emit subtle pheromones. The human was instructed to mirror the infant's movements, but this time, the choreography included leaps, spins, and gestures designed to attract multiple species at once. The human's limbs, already stiff from yesterday's chaos, flailed awkwardly as they attempted to copy the intricate motions. Every misstep triggered squeals, flapping wings, and more pheromone bursts, which caused a chain reaction among the infants that left the human dizzy and overwhelmed. They stumbled into a cluster of creatures, only to have one hop onto their shoulder while another wrapped around a leg, their combined weight pressing the human into the floor with comedic brutality. Each tiny creature seemed to sense the human's embarrassment, and took immense delight in amplifying it, their giggles echoing like bells in the human's ears. Amid the absurd case, the older alien assistant hovered closer, offering subtle guidance. A tilt of an antenna here, a flick of a stubby limb there, and the human found themselves responding instinctively, executing moves that, to a human observer, would seem both ridiculous and accidentally flirtatious. The assistant's eyes gleamed with amusement, and the human's cheeks flushed, realizing that the guidance bordered on flirtation itself. They had never been so physically coordinated in their life, nor so mortified at being caught in such an over-the-top performance. Their body moved in ways that were not entirely their own, limbs entwining with infants, spinning in circles, dipping, and recovering, and yet they began to see a pattern, a rhythm to the madness that suggested some twisted, alien logic to the chaos. The next trial was far worse, the seductive obstacle course. The platform transformed, walls bending and stretching to create slides, soft walls, and dangling tendrils that swayed in hypnotic patterns. The human had to navigate the course while maintaining contact with the infants, responding to their gestures, and avoiding pheromone traps that emitted intense bursts if touched incorrectly. The course was a physical and psychological gauntlet. One slip sent the human tumbling into a pile of giggling, amorous infants, limbs intertwined, pheromones thick in the air. Every misstep elicited squeals and laughter, some playful, some borderline mocking, and the human realized with mounting horror that the entire setup was a deliberate test of endurance, improvisation, and most mortifyingly, sexual adaptability. They were being trained to navigate adult attraction in an environment designed to strip away dignity and exaggerate every reaction. Through the chaos, moments of darkly comic romance began to surface. The older assistant occasionally intervened, guiding the human with a combination of teasing and instruction. A subtle touch here, a nudge there, and the human felt a strange thrill, a mixture of embarrassment and budding attraction that made the absurdity of the situation even more overwhelming. The assistant's expression suggested amusement and approval, and the human, despite themselves, began to look forward to these interactions amidst the chaos. The lesson was as much about reading signals, responding appropriately, and improvising as it was about physical coordination. The human was being molded, bit by bit, into a participant in an alien system of desire they barely understood, all while the infants observed, encouraged, and sometimes sabotaged them in equal measure. Finally, the Queen's Impression exercise commenced, a trial that was part absurd performance, part physical comedy, and part terrifying adult spectacle. A larger, more imposing infant, or perhaps a juvenile overseer, floated above the arena, regarded as a figure of authority and admiration. The human was tasked with performing a series of gestures, spins, and delicate balance moves to gain favor without mishap. One wrong step would trigger a cascade of pheromonal puffs, wrapping the human in sticky goo, entangling limbs, and eliciting loud squeals of approval or mockery from the other infants. The human stumbled repeatedly, each failure more spectacular than the last, yet with every mistake, they noticed a small pattern, timing, rhythm, and eye contact mattered more than strength or speed. Slowly, painfully, they began to anticipate the infant's reactions, matching gestures, predicting responses, and much to their horror, finding themselves enjoying the twisted, eroticized ballet of attention, touch, and chaos. By the end of the session, the human was sprawled across the soft floor, tangled in a mess of limbs, goo, and glitter, gasping for breath. The infants buzzed around them, seemingly satisfied with the chaos they had wrought, while the older assistant floated down to hover nearby, antennae flicking in amusement. The human's chest heaved, muscles ached, and they felt a faint warmth spreading through their body that had nothing to do with exertion. Humiliation, exhaustion, and a strange, reluctant sense of accomplishment mixed into a cocktail of sensations that left them dizzy but oddly exhilarated. They had survived the day's lessons, learned more than they ever wanted about alien attraction, and despite themselves, found their curiosity, and perhaps a hint of desire, stirring toward the alien assistant who guided them through the madness. The nursery, with its deceptive sweetness, absurd games, and eroticized chaos, had claimed another victory, molding its newest human pupil into a creature capable of dancing through absurdity, reading alien signals, and enduring lessons far beyond anything they had imagined. By the time the final day, or what the human assumed was the final day, arrived, the nursery had become a second skin, sticky, glittery, and maddeningly intoxicating. The air hummed with a mixture of pheromones, music, and the tiny squeals of creatures who had long since ceased to seem like simple infants. The human had learned, through trial, error, and humiliation, how to navigate the absurd, eroticized chaos, timing gestures to elicit delight, tilting limbs to maintain attention, even anticipating pheromone bursts before they happened. Each lesson had been more humiliating than the last, yet the relentless, absurd practice had honed them into something ridiculous, competent, and disturbingly aware of their own charm in this alien environment. They could feel it. The lessons had succeeded in stripping away their embarrassment and replacing it with a strange confidence, one that felt both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. The first test of the day was a grand performance, one designed to consolidate everything the human had learned. The arena expanded, shimmering walls forming into a floating labyrinth of platforms, slides, and soft bouncing areas, each adorned with glowing orbs that emitted subtle scent cues. The human was instructed to move through the space, interacting with the infants at each station, mimicking gestures, responding to cues, and maintaining an invisible rhythm. Every misstep triggered bursts of pheromones that caused instant chaos. Infants would pile atop them, cling with surprising strength, and twirl in patterns that threatened to topple them entirely. And yet, as they stumbled and recovered, as limbs tangled and untangled in a ballet of absurdity, the human began to notice the pattern, the hidden logic behind the madness. Every motion had a purpose, every reaction a consequence, and they found themselves moving with an improvisational grace they had never known, a mastery forged in humiliation, sweat, and sticky goo. Amid this chaotic mastery, the older alien assistant hovered nearby, guiding with subtle cues, flicks of an antenna, or a soft trill that cut through the cacophony. Each intervention was playful, teasing, and flirtatious, and the human could no longer deny the pull they felt. The assistant's attention made them aware of themselves in ways they hadn't been before. Their posture, the tilt of a head, the timing of a gesture, all became instruments in this absurd courtship ballet. The human's embarrassment lingered, but it was now tinged with anticipation, a strange blend of fear and desire that made every interaction electrifying. When their limbs brushed during a correction, when a soft trill coincided with a perfectly timed spin, the human felt a spark of connection that was impossible to ignore. The line between instruction, chaos, and romance blurred in a way that was both unsettling and exhilarating. The culmination of the nursery's twisted pedagogy came with the Queen's Acknowledgement, a grand ceremony designed to test the human's mastery, endurance, and adaptability under extreme absurdity. A larger, majestic infant, clearly regarded as the authority figure, floated above the arena. Its eyes glimmered with expectation, antennae flicking rhythmically as a low, resonant hum filled the space. The human was tasked with performing a sequence of gestures, spins, and balancing acts to impress the queen without misstep. One slip, one untimely twitch, and the pheromone-laden chaos would erupt, wrapping them in goo, tangling limbs, and sending a cascade of squeals and laughter echoing across the arena. They stepped forward, limbs trembling, heart racing, and began the performance with a focus born of desperation, embarrassment, and an odd exhilaration. Every motion counted, every glance mattered, and they found themselves moving with confidence they hadn't known they possessed, orchestrating the chaos with human ingenuity, grace, and absurdly erotic precision. As the final gesture concluded, a deliberately awkward but somehow effective pirouette, the queen emitted a trill of approval, the arena erupting in squeals of delight and glittering showers of celebratory pheromones. The infants clung in joyous chaos, and the human collapsed onto a soft platform, panting, sticky, glittering, and exhilarated. The older assistant floated close, antennae twitching with amusement and something warmer, more intimate. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the absurdity fell away, leaving only the shared recognition of accomplishment, attraction, and mutual understanding. The human laughed, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief, as the assistant's tiny limbs reached out to adjust their posture, a gentle touch that felt both corrective and intimate. The connection was undeniable, absurdly awkward, and yet perfectly fitting for the chaotic world they had been thrust into. As the human's mind swirled with the sensation of mastery, affection, and overwhelming absurdity, a small, floating scroll descended from the hovering interface. It read simply, "Congratulations. You have completed the nursery curriculum. Your skills are exemplary." The human blinked, wiping sticky goo from their face, and realized that exile had been transformed into an elaborate, hilarious, and deeply instructive process. They had survived the humiliation, learned alien attraction, mastered absurd rituals, and even discovered a connection with someone who had been both mentor and tease. Pride mingled with lingering embarrassment as they took in the nursery's chaos one last time, noting the piles of tiny, glimmering creatures bouncing, twirling, and shrieking in delight. And yet, as they turned to leave, they noticed a new batch of tiny, plushy infants being wheeled in on floating cribs, their large, gleaming eyes fixed on the human with innocent curiosity. The older assistant gave a subtle, mischievous trill, antennae flicking in a way that suggested, without words, that the cycle was about to begin anew. The human groaned, a mixture of dread and reluctant amusement rising in their chest, and glanced at the assistant, who simply floated close, eyes glinting with playful affection. Exile had become absurd mastery. Chaos had become skill. Humiliation had become, strangely, triumph. And in the midst of glitter, goo, and pheromones, the human understood that they had been transformed, not just into a participant, but into a creature capable of navigating absurd love, bizarre attraction, and alien courtship with ridiculous, darkly comedic proficiency. With a deep breath, they braced themselves for whatever came next, ready to dance again, tumble again, and perhaps, just perhaps, enjoy the madness a little more than they should.